I woke up to the sound of someone whisper yelling outside my living room window, and for a split second I thought I was dreaming, until I realized the voice was way too familiar to be part of a peaceful sleep, because only one person on earth had that specific pitch of angry goose honk righteousness, and that was my neighbor Karen, who had been trying to get me kicked out of my own home ever since I installed a privacy fence that blocked her view of my living room TV from her upstairs window where she sat with binoculars and snacks pretending to be a neighborhood watch but actually just stalking me. And as I peeked through the blinds I saw her wearing a black hoodie that still had a price tag on it, holding her phone in one hand like she was recording a documentary and a crowbar in the other like she was auditioning for a burglary show on cable. And in that moment I knew that whatever she was planning tonight was not only going to backfire, but become the kind of chaos that would double my popcorn budget for the month. Karen had convinced the HOA board that I was a rule breaker, even though the irony was that our little street didn't actually have a real HOA. Just her and two other retired busybodies who liked to pretend they had power by printing their own stationery and stamping papers with a crooked rubber stamp that said violation in Comic Sans, and her latest crusade involved spreading a rumor that I had illegal tenants, unlicensed construction, and underground fight clubs in my basement just because I had extra cars in my driveway and a gym bag once accidentally left by the door. So now her genius plan was to break into my house to film evidence of my supposed crimes and then submit it to her imaginary enforcement committee, because in her mind felony trespassing is called community service. I stayed perfectly still as she tiptoed toward my back door, narrating loudly to her phone as though this was some investigative piece exposing the monster next door, while her ponytail swished like a metronome keeping the beat of stupidity. And I found myself torn between calling the police immediately or letting this unfold like a nature documentary where the predator is also the prey. And since my security cameras were already recording from 3 different angles, I decided to sit back and enjoy the show for just a moment longer, because Karen always claimed I was dramatic, when actually she was the one who turned every minor inconvenience into a war crime. She tried the doorknob first, and when it didn't budge, she whispered something about me blocking her civil right to safety, which made 0 sense because this was my locked house, not public property, but logic had long since filed a restraining order against this woman's brain. And then she shoved the crowbar into the doorframe and grunted like she was prying open a bank vault instead of a wooden patio lock, while continuing to hold her phone up high trying to catch the perfect angle like this was TikTok, and she was moments away from dancing her way to custody. Meanwhile inside, my motion sensors detected a threat and my smart system activated the lights, alarms, and automated recording notices that announced loudly this property is being monitored by security devices and law enforcement has been notified, which caused Karen to screech in surprise and drop the crowbar on her own foot while stumbling backward into one of my potted plants that crashed onto her head like the universe itself bonking her for being stupid. And as she scrambled up she began yelling that I attacked her, which was interesting considering I was still inside sipping yesterday's lukewarm coffee, watching this real-life episode of Dummy vs. Home Security. She ran to the window and started accusing me through the glass of harboring dangerous people, which I assumed meant she saw my life-sized cardboard cutout of Dwayne Johnson in the hallway that I had gotten as a gag gift, but apparently she believed The Rock lived in my house and was part of the secret tenant conspiracy. And she demanded I let her in so she could check the premises for violations, threatening that if I didn't comply she would submit the footage she recorded to the board and have me evicted immediately, even though she had literally just recorded herself committing a crime and narrating it like a confession monologue. I finally unlocked the door but didn't open it, speaking loudly through it so the microphones would capture everything clearly, and asked her with genuine curiosity what rule exactly she believed I broke by being asleep at 2 a.m. in my own home, and she shouted trespassing, which made my brain hurt a little because apparently she thinks my presence inside my property without her permission counts as trespassing, and then she warned me that she had already called the HOA patrol, which was funny, because last time she tried that the police told her to stop impersonating law enforcement and threatened her with a fine. She backed away with dramatic flair, as if she had uncovered a criminal empire, holding her phone proudly while limping on her crowbar-injured foot, promising that she would return with legal authority and a locksmith, and I just stood there silently thinking about how this footage was going to be Exhibit A in whatever police report came next. Then, like an encore performance, she strutted into my backyard again, still recording, trying to find another point of entry, as if repeating her crime from a different angle made it legal. And she started narrating that she smelled illegal chemicals, which was probably just my lavender air freshener, but she claimed it was evidence of a drug lab, and she climbed onto my garden storage box, attempting to reach the second-floor window, but the plastic cracked under her weight, and she toppled backward onto the lawn, making a sound like a deflating pool float, while her phone flew into the grass and continued recording her full Karen meltdown. I knew this was the perfect moment to call the police and ensure the authorities had a front-row seat to this circus. So I dialed the non-emergency number and calmly explained that my neighbor was currently breaking into my home while filming her own crimes for reasons unknown, and the dispatcher said officers were already on the way because the security system alert had pinged them 3 minutes earlier. So I stepped outside to wait and watched as Karen limped around searching for her phone, while mumbling about how she would frame this all as self-defense because apparently she thought my house attacked her. By the time the police car pulled up, she had found her phone and started yelling that I kidnapped her property, which was ironic because her property was the phone she dropped while committing a felony, and she was now accusing me of stealing it before picking it up herself and shoving it into her pocket like that proved something. And the officers approached with raised eyebrows, clearly sensing the level of nonsense radiating from her. She pointed at me wildly, calling me a criminal mastermind, while the officers reviewed my camera footage on their tablet, and I couldn't help but smile because never in my life had karma arrived so quickly wearing a badge while holding popcorn. The police officers stood there for a moment watching Karen pace back and forth on my lawn like a furious rooster with a limp, waving her arm in circles as if she was conducting an orchestra of nonsense, while I stood a few steps back, just trying not to laugh because the officers' facial expressions alone were already enough to tell me they regretted every career decision that led them to this moment. And as soon as one of them asked Karen what she was doing on my property at 2 in the morning, she launched into a speech so chaotic that even the streetlights dimmed like they were trying to avoid listening, claiming that she was a community guardian performing a lawful inspection to ensure I wasn't harboring fugitives or running a criminal hideout in my basement. And when the officers asked who authorized this mission, she proudly declared that the HOA did, which made them glance at each other before responding that there was no registered HOA in this entire neighborhood, and therefore she had the legal authority of a wet sock. It only took 30 seconds of reviewing my security camera footage before any doubt evaporated and the officers turned their attention fully on Karen, who insisted that I had forced her into breaking in through psychic manipulation, and with a straight face, she said that I used emotional terrorism on her, which was apparently her way of describing my existence as a human who pays bills on time and minds his own business. And when the officers asked why she had been holding a crowbar, she switched excuses 3 times in one sentence, starting with home maintenance, ending with metal batten for wildlife safety, and somewhere in the middle calling it a decorative gardening tool. They asked her repeatedly to step off my property while they discussed the situation with me, but Karen refused and said the grass beneath her feet had been part of her yard since the dawn of time, which was impressive considering this house was built 6 years ago. And then she pointed at my surveillance cameras, calling them privacy violations, even though she had literally installed her own camera pointed directly at my backyard months earlier and tried to film me sunbathing before I put up a taller fence, which she complained blocked her God-given view. Finally, the officers escorted her toward the sidewalk, and one took her phone so they could confirm the footage contained the break-in she had bragged about, and even though she tried to snatch it back yelling "Officer, that is private property," they calmly reminded her that evidence of a crime is not considered private, especially when the perpetrator is narrating the crime like a podcast episode titled, "How to Arrest Yourself in Under 5 Minutes." And now she had gone pale, which was a refreshing break from her usual shade of fire engine red. When she realized how bad the footage looked, she suddenly pretended to cry, but the lack of tears made it seem more like she was trying to squeeze invisible lemons into her eyes while begging the officers to believe her story that I had installed a mind control device in my chimney that compelled her to trespass because apparently she was the victim of advanced psychological warfare orchestrated by me and possibly the cardboard cutout of the rock which she suspiciously made eye contact with. Again, like she still thought he might burst out of the shadows with wrestling move. The officers politely told me that they would file a report and that Karen could face charges for attempted illegal entry and vandalism if I wanted to move forward, and as much as the idea of watching her explain herself to a judge sounded like delicious entertainment, a part of me wanted to handle this in a way that made sure she would not only stop but also regret ever trying in the first place. So I asked the officers to document everything, including her crowbar attempts and the damage to my doorframe, and then let me think about pressing charges after reviewing her full behavior with my lawyer, because I suspected this was not going to be her final meltdown. Karen overheard the word lawyer and suddenly started shrieking that I was suing the poor innocent neighbor who just cared about safety, and she clutched her ankle dramatically like she was waiting for applause, claiming it was broken or shattered or maybe bitten by a poisonous plant on my property, because of course she needed a reason to blame me for gravity doing its job. And when the officers suggested calling paramedics, she stood up perfectly fine and announced that she would heal naturally. Since she was brave, which only made the officers sigh like parents dealing with a toddler who refuses to nap. They warned her clearly that if she came onto my property again for any unauthorized purpose, she would be arrested immediately, and that filing any false reports would result in additional charges. And Karen listened with the posture of a child forced to say sorry without meaning it. Then she stomped away, muttering something about justice and community decay and corruption, while the officers handed me a case number and advised me to call if she returned with more nonsense. After they left, I walked back inside, locking everything again just in case Karen tried to respawn like a video game villain, and I sat down at the kitchen table replaying the footage from my cameras because watching Karen argue with a motion sensor about her constitutional rights was comedy therapy I didn't know I needed, and I considered how she would probably spin this entire thing into a story where she was the hero exposing evil neighbors, conveniently leaving out the part where she committed a felony while filming herself from multiple angles like an influencer of crime. The next morning, the neighborhood group chat exploded with gossip, because Karen apparently woke up early and tried delivering a speech to everyone about how she was targeted for caring too much about her community and that I was hiding dangerous secrets, but no one bought it since she had a history of ridiculous accusations, including the time she claimed Mr. Patterson across the street was running an international smuggling ring because he had too many Amazon boxes after Christmas, and when he showed her the boxes were filled with dog toys, she accused him of stockpiling weapons for a canine army, so credibility had long ago skipped town. I spent my breakfast calmly writing down everything that happened while checking the damages around the back door, which were easily fixable, but I wanted proper documentation just in case because I had a feeling that last night was simply Karen's warm-up round, and now that she thought she was on some sort of heroic quest to cleanse the neighborhood, she would escalate, especially since she believed she nearly caught me doing something illegal, and I could already see her flipping through imaginary rulebooks looking for violations to charge me with like a mall cop with too much caffeine and not enough authority. Later that afternoon, a note showed up taped to my mailbox written in cursive that looked like it was trying to strangle each letter, telling me I had 1 week to vacate my home or face immediate community action, signed by the HOA Enforcement Division, which as far as I could tell consisted of only Karen, her printer, and her ego. And as I read it I realized the war had just started, and she had no idea I had every weapon necessary already recorded in high definition waiting to turn her crusade into her own downfall, because if she wanted to play this game I was more than ready to watch her lose spectacularly. Karen's threatening note lingered in my thoughts the entire day like a fly that keeps returning no matter how many times you swat, and I could practically hear her smug voice narrating the words aloud as I reread the ridiculous command that I had 1 week to vacate my own legally owned home, which she believed she controlled through the authority of a fantasy HOA that only existed in her imagination and cheap stationery. I briefly wondered if she stood outside rehearsing the moment she would evict me with grand gestures and maybe a red carpet rolled out for her own victory parade, but what really fascinated me was her belief that she could win a battle of logic, law, and evidence when she had already recorded herself breaking in like the world's worst YouTuber looking to speedrun getting arrested. I tucked the letter away in a folder labeled Karen Fails Volume 1 because something told me I would eventually need Volume 2 and 3, then sat down at my desk to check the camera footage again to see if she had left any other surprises while I slept, and to my utter lack of shock she had indeed returned around 7 a.m. to lecture my front door about ordinance compliance while filming herself and giving a tour of what she called the future liberated property, which was apparently mine but she planned to rule over like a suburban dictator. She paced in front of my porch claiming the fencing height violated standards, and that my flower bed was harboring invasive species, and that my mailbox was angled improperly toward the street in an act of hostile aggression against neighborhood aesthetics, all of which would have been more insulting if she had any actual authority beyond being permanently angry. She even tried to measure my driveway with a broken ruler she found in her garage before loudly declaring violations and writing notes in her binder labeled evidence, even though it was just scribbles of nonsense like dangerous hose and possible underground passages, which made me wonder if she thought I was building a secret lair beneath the patio. Watching this, I couldn't help laughing because Karen's imagination was the most ambitious part of her personality, and the more desperate she got, the more confident she seemed that she was some kind of suburban Sherlock Holmes uncovering criminal plots. But beneath all the comedy, I knew this wasn't harmless. Karen was escalating, and people like her didn't stop until something forced them to face reality with consequences heavy enough to crush their delusion. I took the entire binder of police documentation and camera clips to my lawyer that afternoon, who after 5 minutes of reviewing the footage removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes like he had been confronted with the purest form of stupidity known to mankind, and asked if my neighbor had escaped from somewhere that specialized in padded walls, because he hadn't seen this level of self-incriminating effort in years. He told me I had every right to press charges immediately, but also pointed out that if we waited a little longer, she would probably add even more crimes to the collection since she clearly wasn't done embarrassing herself, and while any normal person might worry about waiting too long, I knew Karen would not disappoint because she was fueled by righteous delusion and HOA-themed caffeine. When I returned home, I noticed something new on my lawn that hadn't been there before. A giant handmade sign stuck into the grass with a crooked stake that declared illegal resident investigation ongoing authorized personnel only in large red handwriting that looked like an angry toddler had written it with ketchup, and I began laughing so loud that a jogger passing by gave me a thumbs up without even knowing why, the comedy being contagious. It didn't take long for Karen to appear because she had installed herself as a guard near her window like a hawk watching prey, and she marched over immediately yelling that I was not permitted to remove the sign because it was an official notice from the HOA, which made me ask her nicely to show any legal paperwork proving the HOA existed, and she responded by accusing me of destroying community property with my eyes because apparently staring counts as vandalism now. Then she changed tactics and demanded to inspect my backyard garage again since she believed illegal construction was happening behind those doors, which was funny because the only thing inside that garage were spare tools, a lawnmower, and the accumulation of good life decisions she never had. But I calmly reminded her that she was legally barred from entering or stepping foot further onto my land or she would be arrested, and she responded by pretending she was taking notes for a violation. Report while mumbling this entire house is a violation under her breath. I decided to let her stew in her own drama while I installed a few additional security features, including a new camera near the garage and a motion-activated recording spotlight that would ensure any late-night Karen expedition would be captured in cinematic glory, and the satisfaction of tightening those screws felt like preparing a trap in a comedic cartoon where the villain repeatedly runs face-first into the same mistake. By evening, the neighborhood had grown curious about the escalating tension because Karen couldn't keep her mouth shut and had been going door to door telling people she was fighting crime by evicting a dangerous lawbreaker, which only made Mrs. Halsey from across the street text me asking if I had joined a secret agent program because Karen was convinced I was hiding fugitives trained in martial arts, and when I told her the truth, she sent back 10 laughing emojis and said she was making popcorn for whatever happened next. Dinner that night tasted like anticipation because I could feel Karen brewing up a plan that would outdo her previous disaster, and part of me was already guessing she would return after dark for another recording attempt, especially since she probably convinced herself the police only sided with me because she lacked enough footage to prove wrongdoing. So I wrote the date on a fresh page of my documentation folder in large letters because I knew I was about to add more content. Around midnight the motion sensor pinged and the recording spotlight flashed to life, bathing the backyard in bright light, and as I opened my security feed I saw Karen crouching near the side gate wearing camouflage that matched nothing in the environment, holding a pair of bolt cutters in one hand and her phone in the other, narrating in a dramatic whisper that she had to disable my illegal perimeter defenses to uncover the truth inside before this criminal empire expanded to the whole street, and I could barely hold my laughter because she looked like someone's mom trying to cosplay as a spy without knowing how any of the equipment worked. She clipped the first chain link with a loud snap and then stopped to shush the silence around her like she expected guard dogs or henchmen to appear, but all she got was my automated voice system announcing "You are trespassing, leave immediately," which sent her into panic mode as she tried to unlock the gate faster while saying she had the right to rescue the community from my tyranny. I waited until she stepped fully onto my property before calling the police again because I wanted everything on record, and this time I also turned on the outdoor speakers so every word she spoke echoed through the yard, making her frantic commentary sound like a comedy broadcast, and when the sirens finally became audible, she tried to retreat by climbing back through the cut fence hole, but her camouflage hoodie snagged on the metal, leaving her dangling partially while still trying to record the escape like a failing stunt double. When the officers arrived, she pleaded with them not to trust anything they had seen or heard because she was on a mission for justice, but their patience was gone and they cuffed her calmly while she blurted out more conspiracy theories involving secret tunnels, fake documents, and mind control plants growing near my flower bed, and as they put her in the back of the police cruiser, she screamed that this was not over and that she would return stronger than ever. What she didn't realize was that she had just made my case unbreakable, because now I had footage of multiple break-ins, vandalism, and attempted criminal entry, along with police witness accounts and her own recordings, and as the cruiser drove away with her glaring at me like a villain promising revenge in the sequel, I knew the war was far from finished, but I also knew the final victory would be spectacular. With Karen temporarily removed from circulation thanks to her late-night espionage attempt ending in handcuffs, the neighborhood experienced a rare moment of peace that felt so unfamiliar I almost forgot what silence sounded like without the faint background noise of Karen yelling about something that didn't matter. But quiet around here never lasted long because Karen treated reality like a trampoline, always bouncing back even when logic and consequences tried to flatten her. Sure enough, only 48 hours later, I woke up to the sound of tires screeching outside, and when I looked out the window I saw Karen being dropped off by what looked like her cousin's rusted minivan, stepping out dramatically wearing a medical boot on her foot and a bright yellow safety vest like she was returning from a heroic mission rather than being released after a trespassing incident, and she immediately pointed at my home as if announcing to an invisible audience that the villain had not yet been defeated. She stood there glaring with her hands on her hips, shouting something about how the police were biased and how she was filing a complaint with the mayor, the governor, the president, and potentially the United Nations, because according to her my house was now violating some kind of global peace treaty, and her voice carried enough theatrical projection to echo across the street, waking up several neighbors whose heads popped out of windows in synchronized annoyance. Karen now believed she had become a martyr in a battle for suburban justice and therefore needed a bigger stage, so she took out her phone and went live, broadcasting to the 3 unlucky souls who hadn't blocked her channel yet, claiming she was risking her freedom to expose my secret operations, which now included, according to her growing imagination, smuggling exotic animals, hacking neighborhood Wi-Fi, and hiding a hostage in the attic who only communicated through the blinking pattern of my holiday lights, and as she spun this web of nonsense she pointed dramatically at my house like a TV reporter on a weather channel announcing a hurricane of crime. Moments later, reinforcements arrived in the form of HOA board members which consisted of exactly 2 people. Mildred, who always sided with Karen because she needed a hobby, and George, who just went along with anything that kept him from returning home to the 7 cats that ruled his life like furry tyrants. They marched toward my property line waving clipboards covered in laminated homemade rules, yelling that they demanded an immediate home inspection to ensure compliance with community standards, and I calmly stepped outside to greet them with the most polite expression I could muster, even though internally I was imagining confetti cannons celebrating the moment they all spontaneously tripped on their own egos. I told them clearly and firmly that they had no legal authority here, something I had already explained multiple times, but Karen puffed herself up and declared that due to my alleged criminal activity she was invoking emergency HOA intervention, a phrase that felt like it belonged in a cartoon universe rather than real life, and she demanded I surrender my house keys for evidence gathering, which made George nod vigorously like a bobblehead trying to keep a job. I informed them that the police had already handled the situation and advised Karen to stay off my property, but she cut me off yelling that police were merely puppets of corruption and true justice required citizens like her to take charge. She then produced a document she had printed with a shiny golden sticker that looked like something taken from a children's craft kit, and she shoved it into my hand screaming that it was a lawful eviction notice. I stared at the paper and realized it wasn't even properly formatted. The text was full of typos, including the word neighbor spelled 3 different ways, and it ended with a signature line that simply read Supreme HOA Authority, which I guessed referred to her new self-appointed title. Rather than arguing further, I took the paper and tore it in half while staying on my side of the property line, watching Karen gasp like I had just destroyed the Declaration of Independence. She screeched so loud that a dog 3 houses down began barking in solidarity against the chaos, and then she turned to her livestream audience saying, "You see this, he's destroying legal documents," which she believed would play well online, except the comments immediately filled with people telling her to go home, go to therapy, or go touch some grass, and she angrily blocked half of them within 20 seconds. Then came the moment she escalated from comedic threat to desperate delusion. She stepped 1 foot across the invisible property boundary and announced that since I refused to comply she was placing my home under HOA seizure, which apparently meant she now owned it, and she looked back expecting Mildred and George to cheer, but they both suddenly pretended to check their clipboards because neither wanted to be arrested again after seeing how quickly police responded last time. Slowly stepping forward like she was taking over a castle, Karen demanded that I remove my belongings and vacate the house by sundown, which was hilariously dramatic considering we were standing under a blazing noon sun, and then she pointed at my security camera stating that she would disable all surveillance since recording law enforcement actions was illegal in her rulebook. My patience was hanging by a thread thinner than her understanding of property law, so I simply said the magic words that had worked every time so far. "Karen, you are trespassing." Just like a fire alarm being activated, my automated voice system repeated the warning loudly through the speakers, which immediately made Karen freeze mid-step, because even she recognized that sound now meant police would likely be here soon, and she started yelling at my house like it was sentient, refusing her commands, insisting that technology was a tyrannical enemy of the people. Neighbors began filming her from their porches, some sipping iced tea like they were at a live performance of Karen, the musical, and others laughed quietly, trying not to provoke her further, but attention only fueled her. She turned to them and shouted that they were all witnesses to her bravery in defending the neighborhood from my terrorism, and at that exact moment a delivery truck rolled up to drop off a package for me, which Karen seized instantly, ripping the box from the driver's hands and yelling that it was evidence of illegal importation. The poor delivery guy stared at her like she was a raccoon suddenly speaking English. Then he turned to me for help, but Karen held the package behind her back like a toddler refusing to give up stolen candy. The driver radioed his dispatcher reporting a hostile individual interfering with deliveries, and I knew the police would now have not just one but two reasons to reappear today. As luck or karma would have it, the same officers from earlier incidents returned, stepping out of their cruiser with the exhausted expressions of people who were developing recurring nightmares featuring this specific woman. Karen ran up to them shouting she had seized contraband on behalf of the community, and the officers calmly asked whose package it was. When I raised my hand, Karen tried to hide the box behind her leg like a child caught cheating, insisting that possession gave her legal rights, but the officers took the package and handed it back to me. Then something beautiful happened. One officer informed her that she was now under investigation for mail theft, a federal crime far more serious than trespassing or cutting a fence, and for a moment her brain seemed to crash like outdated software, eyes blinking rapidly as she attempted to reboot her excuses. She backpedaled, claiming she thought the package was a bomb sent by me to myself to frame her, which sounded like the dumbest plot twist ever written, and when that failed she tried apologizing but ruined it by adding that I forced her to commit mail theft by making her suspicious with my shady yard decorations. The officers told her she had exactly one chance left: leave me alone permanently and stop harassing the neighborhood, or the next time she would be taken into custody and not released within 48 hours. Karen swore she would comply, promising she would never step foot on my property again, but the fire in her eyes told me she was just regrouping, mentally drawing up her next disastrous plan, because this kind of obsession didn't end with warnings. This was a person who would have to crash face-first into rock-solid consequences before she finally broke the cycle of stupidity. As the officers drove away again, neighbors dispersed, and Karen hobbled back to her home holding her binder like it contained her last shred of dignity. I watched her disappear through her front door, and while I finally had a moment to breathe, something told me that we had not yet reached the grand finale. Karen was down, but nowhere near done, and the next move she made could either be her ultimate victory in her own delusional mind or the final nail she hammered into her own coffin, and deep down I knew the latter was already underway. For almost 2 days, the neighborhood felt like it had been dipped in a rare potion of peace, the kind where birds dared to chirp again without Karen accusing them of trespassing in the airspace she believed she owned. I tried to enjoy the calm, fixing my fence where she had cut through it and cleaning up the mess she left behind, all while knowing deep in my bones that Karen was inside her house plotting her next big move like a cartoon villain staring at a blueprint made of crayons and conspiracy theories. She could never let things go, especially because now she felt publicly embarrassed and people like her treated embarrassment as a personal war declaration. So when I saw her blinds fluttering every time I walked past a window, I knew she was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike with all the tactical intelligence of a squirrel that keeps running into traffic because it believes cars are optional suggestions. On the third morning after the package incident, I woke up to tire tracks in my driveway that weren't mine and a new sign pinned to my front door reading "Final Notice of Community Seizure," which made me sigh, the kind of sigh that comes from deep in the soul when you realize stupidity has returned stronger than ever. I removed the sign and noticed a flyer stuck underneath my windshield wiper, showcasing an invitation to a community hearing regarding my eviction held at Karen's house that evening, with an RSVP section at the bottom that had already been filled out for me with a giant X next to the word attending. My first instinct was to laugh because Karen hosting a community hearing was like a raccoon hosting a formal tea party, but then I remembered she had access to basic office supplies and zero self-awareness, which made anything possible. Throughout the day, she marched from door to door delivering dramatic monologues about how justice was finally coming to remove the criminal force that was me, and while she spoke, neighbors politely nodded then immediately rolled their eyes once she turned away, sending me texts saying things like free popcorn if you need extra for the show or should I wear a suit to your trial. By the afternoon, Karen decided to escalate her intimidation tactic by setting up traffic cones in the street marking off what she called a restricted zone around my property, directing cars to detour even though this was a residential cul-de-sac with exactly zero through traffic. I watched from my porch as she wore a whistle around her neck and blew it aggressively at anyone existing within a 10-foot radius of her imaginary perimeter, yelling enforcement duty like she was auditioning for a discount superhero movie where the only superpower was petty rage. Then came the truly unsettling part. She installed a new camera on a pole in her yard pointed directly at my house, claiming it was for evidence gathering, and she posted a sign underneath that said facial recognition in progress, which was a technological lie so bold that even the camera looked embarrassed. Knowing how much she loved documenting every second of her crusade, I decided to beat her at her own game by making sure every angle of her nonsense was recorded. I adjusted my cameras again and added a microphone near the front walkway, not to spy but to legally protect myself because Karen was clearly preparing to attempt something spectacularly stupid. As the sun dipped beneath the rooftops, neighbors slowly gathered in groups whispering and laughing, watching Karen set up folding chairs in her backyard like she was preparing for a courtroom drama sponsored by Chaos. She even had a podium made from stacked milk crates, a megaphone, and a binder thicker than a tax audit, which she placed down with the seriousness of someone who believed history books would one day document her bravery. When the time came for her so-called hearing, she knocked on my door like she was serving royal summons, and when I opened it just a crack she demanded I attend the proceedings so I could confess my crimes in front of the community. I told her point blank that I was not going anywhere near her property after repeated police warnings and legal restrictions, which only made her grin like she had been waiting for that answer. She raised her megaphone and shouted loud enough to wake every sleeping bird that I was refusing to comply with lawful proceedings and therefore she would hold the hearing without me, which was probably safer for my sanity anyway. So I watched through my cameras as she called the meeting to order, clearing her throat dramatically before speaking into the megaphone even though there were only 6 people sitting 5 feet away. She welcomed everyone to the trial of the century and announced the charges against me one by one, which included unapproved flower colors, suspiciously fast Wi-Fi, possession of a cardboard cutout meant to intimidate, possible illegal pet ownership of the squirrel that visited my bird feeder, and aggressive lawn care equipment. One neighbor who had always tolerated Karen's antics finally raised his hand and asked politely if any of these accusations were real laws or just things she made up while angry, and Karen responded by accusing him of aiding and abetting a dangerous fugitive. When the audience began questioning her logic more than applauding it, she decided to introduce what she called the evidence, projecting video clips onto a wrinkled bedsheet she had taped to the fence. But since she only had her phone to display them, the footage showed up tiny and upside down, making it look like she was hosting a film festival dedicated to incomprehensible blurry nonsense. Every time she tried fast-forwarding, she accidentally rewinded, and every time she tried pausing, she froze the video on her own face mid-scream. Even better, every clip showed exactly what the police documented. Her breaking into my backyard, whispering like a villain, falling repeatedly, and narrating her crimes like confession audio commentary. As the crowd watched her greatest hits of stupidity, laughter spread so loudly Karen lost control of the meeting. She yelled at them for disrespecting a lawful trial and slammed her binder shut so aggressively that half her papers flew into the air like confetti celebrating her failure. The neighbors slowly walked away shaking their heads, leaving her alone with her megaphone and humiliation glowing red on her cheek. Furious and frantic, she grabbed the bedsheet screen, ripped it down, and stormed inside her house, slamming the door so hard that a ceramic garden gnome toppled over on her porch like even the decoration was done with her behavior. I sat inside watching this unfold live on my monitors, and even though it was hilarious, I felt a quiet twinge of realization. Karen was unraveling faster than ever. Every social attempt to embarrass me was backfiring spectacularly, leaving her reputation shredded to bits in front of the very people she hoped to recruit as allies. And when a person like Karen runs out of support, logic, and patience, they do something even more desperate. They turn their wrath entirely toward the person they blame for their downfall. Which, in her eyes, was me. I locked every window, reset every camera angle, and triple-checked the automated alert system. Something told me Karen wasn't just going to come back. She was going to do it bigger, louder, and dumber than she ever had before. Karen disappeared from public view the next day, which would normally be the kind of peaceful relief any rational person appreciated, but with her it was more like the eerie silence in a horror movie right before the masked lunatic charges in screaming. I could practically feel her plotting from behind those tightly closed blinds, her brain cooking up a new master plan built entirely out of ego and bad ideas. I remained cautious, checking cameras constantly and making sure any door or gate was locked, because I knew Karen would not accept defeat after the disaster she called a community trial. She had embarrassed herself so thoroughly that her pride needed revenge to stop shriveling. And she always convinced herself that the more dramatic she made the situation, the more righteous she would look to the world. So when the sun went down and everything looked calm, I knew she was just waiting for darkness to unleash whatever she believed counted as a tactical maneuver. Right around midnight, one of the motion alerts triggered on my phone, accompanied by my backyard spotlight automatically igniting the night. Instantly I saw Karen on my screen wearing all black again, this time with cheap face paint smeared like a rejected bank robber costume, holding what looked like a camcorder from the early 2000s strapped to her chest with duct tape, as if she had upgraded from smartphone crime recording to documentary-level stupidity. Her voice was incredibly loud for someone trying to sneak around, narrating how she was about to infiltrate enemy territory and expose the criminal kingpin next door, and as she tried to climb the fence she slipped and landed in my flower bed face first, but she popped up pretending like she meant to do that, brushing dirt off her cheeks while whispering yes, infiltration complete, like she had succeeded in a mission instead of failing physics. I dialed the police yet again but decided not to confront her this time because I wanted the footage to cover everything clearly without her overacting derailing it like usual. She approached the garage door and pulled out a lock-picking kit she clearly bought off some sketchy website that promised spy results in 5 minutes, but since she had the skills of a toddler trying to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded, each failed attempt made her angrier and louder. When that failed, she tried spoken intimidation as though yelling at a lock would make it surrender its secrets, shouting open in the name of community compliance repeatedly while shaking the door violently. After a minute of failure, she whispered to her camera that the lock was illegally reinforced with underground hacking technology, proving further evidence of dangerous crimes. She moved around the corner, her steps loud enough to wake the entire floral kingdom under her feet, and her poorly positioned camcorder swung wildly with every dramatic whisper, making the footage mostly a collection of blurry sky shots and her own chin. Then she stopped near the siding of my house, staring up at a small basement window that was barely a foot wide. And because Karen operated purely on determination and zero spatial reasoning, she actually believed she could fit through it. She stacked 2 empty plant pots and a half-broken storage bin beneath it to climb, wobbling like a toddler building a tower out of Jenga blocks during an earthquake, and somehow she managed to get her torso through the opening, but halfway in she realized a major flaw. Her hips were not following. She wriggled like a trapped raccoon stuck in a vending machine and started yelling at her own body to cooperate, insisting that she was gluten-free and therefore aerodynamic. I was biting my knuckle to keep from laughing because the camera captured everything perfectly. Karen halfway inside my basement, legs kicking in the air like she was swimming through concrete, narrating her struggle and claiming the house was illegally gripping her with gravity trap. After finally sliding inside like a poorly aimed bowling ball, she landed on the basement floor groaning, but stood up with renewed determination. Inside, my security cameras continued recording every inch of her embarrassing investigation as she shined a flashlight everywhere looking for crimes. She pointed the light at a stack of storage boxes labeled Christmas lights, and gasped dramatically, telling her camera this is where he hides the evidence of illegal lighting operations, which made no sense whatsoever. When she passed the cardboard cutout of Dwayne Johnson again, she screamed, thinking a muscular intruder was waiting to fight her, then tried to reason with it out loud while breathing heavily, insisting she held no weapons except truth. The best part was when she discovered my treadmill and immediately assumed it was a human transport conveyor that smuggled criminals from one hideout to another. But her paranoia finally peaked when she noticed the blinking router lights and began filming the Wi-Fi box like she had discovered an alien artifact, describing it as advanced military technology disguised as internet equipment used for mass civilian surveillance. Meanwhile, her movements triggered the interior alarm system, which automatically sent a new alert to the police, who by now were practically on standby in the neighborhood waiting for Karen's next meltdown. The sirens sounded just as Karen reached the basement stairs, and she panicked so hard that she tried escaping back out the tiny window she came through. But, once again, her hips were not on her side. She wriggled and flailed and insisted loudly that the window was shrinking on purpose based on government orders, all while the camcorder recorded her latest failure from an unflattering angle that would surely make for viral content one day. When officers entered the basement calling out warnings, Karen immediately shouted that she was the victim of a house kidnapping and that the criminal mastermind was hiding behind invisible walls, which was impressive because it reached a new height of absurdity even for her. The officers recognized her instantly and sighed loudly enough that the microphones picked it up clearly. Then they helped detach her from the window, but not before reminding her that she was under arrest for breaking and entering. Karen screamed betrayal at the camera strapped to her chest, as though her own recording device had sided with the enemy. As they led her out the front door, neighbors gathered once again like it was a recurring neighborhood festival, phones out capturing the moment Karen loudly promised that she would not rest until my criminal empire collapsed. Except this time, the police did not give her the usual gentle warning. They placed her in cuffs with the full expectation that she would not be returning home the next day or the one after that. Watching the cruiser drive away, I finally allowed myself a long, slow breath. Karen had just crossed into felony territory with evidence so clear even she couldn't deny it, and the law was no longer treating her as a confused neighborhood nuisance. She was now officially a criminal in pursuit of imaginary criminals. But even as relief washed over me, a new thought surfaced. What if Karen had allies, or someone who actually believed her stories? People as delusional as her existed everywhere, and she was the type to rally anyone who would listen. This war might be nearing its climax, but I had a feeling the final chapter would be the wildest yet. When Karen was removed from the neighborhood in the back of a police cruiser for the second time, I foolishly believed this was finally the conclusion, the point where logic would shove her off the stage and let normal life resume. But people like Karen don't disappear quietly, they regroup with more chaos in their pockets, and I should have known her obsession was too powerful to be contained by a short stay in holding, so when she returned a week later riding in the passenger seat of a car, driven by a man wearing a bright red blazer and a cheap Bluetooth headset, I knew immediately that Karen hadn't just found support, she had found someone even more dramatic than she was. This man stepped out of the car as if the ground beneath him was a red carpet, holding a clipboard like it was a presidential decree, and Karen followed behind him with a posture so smug she might as well have been wearing a crown, waving proudly to the handful of confused neighbors watching from windows and porches, loudly announcing that justice had arrived. The real HOA authority was now here. Before I could even process the absurdity, the man strutted directly toward my property line and declared in a booming voice that he was Douglas Pennington III, Chief Compliance Officer of the National Neighborhood Excellence Bureau, which sounded like the kind of organization invented by a bored toddler with access to a typewriter, and he said he had been summoned by Karen to investigate severe community endangerment violations on my land. Karen stood beside him nodding with the energy of a bobblehead fueled by revenge, pointing at my house and whisper-yelling that this was the criminal headquarters she had been risking her life to expose, and Douglas made a show of writing something down dramatically, his pen gliding across the clipboard like he was engraving history. I calmly informed him that no such bureau existed and asked for official credentials, expecting him to crumble immediately, but instead he reached into his blazer and produced a laminated card that looked like it had been printed at a library 15 minutes earlier, featuring his name spelled incorrectly and an eagle logo clip art that I had definitely seen on a bumper sticker last year. As I questioned the legitimacy of his badge, Douglas gasped as if I had insulted the crown jewels and lectured me about respecting national authorities, while Karen chimed in that refusal to cooperate would be added to my charges of neighborhood terrorism. I told them both plainly that the police had already documented Karen's felonies and warned her to stay away, but Karen cut me off screaming that those police were corrupt agents controlled by me, because apparently I now had enough influence to run a suburban mafia but not enough to mow my lawn without her approval. While I recorded everything on my porch camera, Douglas announced that due to emergency risk factors he would perform an immediate perimeter sweep, and Karen followed him like a cheerleader for delusion, pointing out random objects and labeling them as violations, including my recycling bin which she called a hazardous waste facility and a garden hose she accused of being a concealed weapon. They crossed onto my property without permission, so I warned them once verbally and once through the automated system, but instead of stopping they claimed the announcements were fake government propaganda designed to intimidate whistleblowers. Neighbors began gathering again, some recording, some enjoying their front row seats to Karen's Episode 7 meltdown, and while Douglas sprinted around measuring imaginary hazards with a ruler that kept bending, Karen stood at the edge of my driveway holding a megaphone she must have bought in bulk by now, shouting that my garage was a threat to America. When I saw Douglas approach the side gate carrying a crowbar he had borrowed from Karen's arsenal of stupidity, I knew things were escalating into a level of trespassing even the officers would want to frame as instructional training footage, so I called 911 before this farce turned dangerous. Karen noticed the call and shrieked that I was reporting lawful authority to protect my criminal activity, then ordered Douglas to breach the gate immediately, and he attempted to wedge the crowbar between the hinges with all the strength of a man battling common sense. The officers arrived just in time to watch Douglas struggling with the gate while yelling legal jargon he clearly learned from courtroom dramas, and Karen tried to block the police by standing in front of them and screaming citizen's arrest, pointing at me as if she believed she held jurisdiction over the law itself. The officers brushed past her and confronted Douglas, who refused to drop the crowbar until he was told that breaking a locked gate without consent was felony vandalism, and suddenly his bravado melted into panic as he asked if this was merely a stern warning or actual consequences, to which the officer replied that using a weapon to break into private property is the very definition of consequences. While Douglas attempted a confused apology filled with corporate buzzwords like synergy and compliance restoration effort, Karen made her final mistake of the day by grabbing the officer's arm and demanding he arrest me instead, insisting she had evidence in her binder that proved I was a danger to national HOA security, and the officer calmly turned to her and said she had violated her release conditions by coming anywhere near my home again. Karen froze, mouth wide open like her voice momentarily malfunctioned, then she started screaming that she was being silenced by a conspiracy and that she would file lawsuits in every court known to mankind. But the officers had heard enough. They handcuffed both violators while neighbors clapped, and one guy even whistled like it was the encore of a comedy show. As they were placed into the back of the cruiser, Douglas begged the officers not to tell his mother, which was the first honest thing spoken that entire afternoon, and Karen kicked the seat in front of her like a toddler denied dessert, shouting that prison bars couldn't contain her justice and that I hadn't seen the last of her. When the police cruiser finally drove off, the entire street burst into relieved laughter, with Mrs. Halsey handing me a slice of celebratory banana bread and saying that the HOA meeting next month would be renamed Karen Appreciation Day because she provided endless entertainment. I smiled, thanked everyone for their support, but inside I felt a bone-deep exhaustion mixed with anticipation because even though Karen was removed yet again, her obsession had reached a level of absurd fanaticism that frightened me more than annoyed me. Someone who believes they are the protagonist of a holy war doesn't stop until forced to face a reality too solid to argue with. And judging by the escalating stupidity each time she returned, the grand finale was coming like a storm that everyone could sense but no one could predict. My house was stronger than her ego, my evidence was heavier than her delusions, and yet I prepared once again for whatever she would throw at me next, because this wasn't just a neighborhood feud anymore, this was the final stretch of a battle Karen believed she was destined to win, and the most dangerous moment is always right before everything falls apart for the villain who can't accept defeat. Karen's arrest alongside her fake compliance officer should have been the climactic ending to this entire saga, the moment she finally realized that real life doesn't bend to imagination or poorly laminated badges, but her mind didn't operate on the laws of logic or humility, and even while sitting in a cell she was cooking up her most outrageous comeback yet, because when she was released after processing, she didn't stroll back quietly. She arrived home in a frenzy of determination, as if she thought prison time granted her a diploma in law enforcement. I spotted her through my window stepping out of yet another ride, this time a ride-share whose driver looked deeply relieved to see her go, and she stormed inside her house without even glancing at my property, which should have been reassuring but instead felt like the calm before a hurricane of idiocy. For 3 whole days she was eerily silent, and I found myself jumping every time a leaf blew across my yard, because silence from someone who thrives on chaos is never a sign of surrender, it's a warning. My neighbor, Mr. Patterson, suggested she might finally have learned her lesson, but I knew Karen's ego had the durability of a steel beam wrapped in denial, so I increased security again, not out of fear for my safety but because I wanted every second of her self-destruction recorded in high definition for the judge who would eventually need a laugh. On the 4th night, as the moon stood high and the street glowed under soft lamplight, the alarms triggered once more, but this time the alert was coming from the front rather than the back of the property. I rushed to the living room feed, and what I saw nearly made me spit out the water I had been drinking. Karen was wearing a full-body suit of black spandex under a reflective safety vest like a confused superhero who couldn't pick a theme, carrying a megaphone in one hand and a thick legal-looking folder in the other. But that wasn't even the most absurd part. Behind her was a group of 5 strangers wearing neon shirts that read Official HOA Task Force in childish lettering, and each of them carried random objects like rope, a broom, bolt cutters, and what might have been a hockey stick, the kind of gear you gather when you announce a mission without explaining what it is. Karen marched up to my front lawn with her entourage, yelling through her megaphone that this was an emergency repossession and that everyone needed to evacuate the infrastructure crime zone immediately. She pointed accusingly at my house as if it had personally insulted her ancestors, and she declared in dramatic fashion that she had assembled the actual legitimate HOA board from online volunteer sources, which made me wonder if she had just bribed strangers on social media with promises of snacks. The group behind her didn't seem fully committed either. 2 guys looked like they had only joined because they thought there would be pizza, and one woman kept asking if there was a bathroom nearby. They followed her because she shouted with authority, but their uncertainty was obvious, especially when Karen instructed them to breach the entrance and recover illegal documents from inside the property, and none of them moved, probably realizing that committing crimes wasn't part of the volunteer job description they had been sold. I stepped out onto the porch because the police were already on their way thanks to the alert system, and because I wanted to see her face when her finale collapsed. And as soon as I appeared, she pointed at me triumphantly, screaming, "We have you surrounded," even though they were only blocking about 20 degrees of possible escape routes. I calmly stated that this was private property, and that every person involved was now partaking in criminal trespassing staged by a known repeat offender, but Karen raised her folder and yelled that she had obtained emergency federal eviction authorization, flipping open the papers to reveal pages she had printed from a website clearly titled "How to Create Your Own Legal Document for Dummies," and the stamp she used appeared to be a simple ink pad swirl that resembled a cinnamon roll more than a government seal. As she prepared to give the order to invade my home, police sirens split through the night air with perfect timing, and her ragtag crew immediately panicked like pigeons seeing a cat. One man dropped the broom and sprinted toward his car, another loudly declared he never agreed to felonies and took off running down the street, and the woman with the bathroom emergency shouted, "Sorry Karen, I'm not going to jail for property line drama," before fleeing. Within seconds her entire task force fell apart like a poorly taped cardboard set, leaving her alone waving her megaphone like a flag of failure. She attempted to bar the police from approaching, screaming that they were interfering with federal eviction laws, but the officers ignored her theatrics as if she were a background character in a show only she believed she starred in. When they informed her that this violation was her third strike in the span of weeks, and that she was now facing a list of charges longer than her binder of delusions, Karen completely lost whatever tiny grip she had on stability, screaming that I had bewitched the entire neighborhood into siding with evil, insisting that my house had mind control Wi-Fi lasers, accusing the cardboard cutout of Dwayne Johnson of being a henchman guarding illegal trophies, and ranting so wildly that even the officers momentarily looked stunned at the level of nonsense. They cuffed her yet again, and this time she didn't go quietly. She kicked her legs and shrieked, claiming she was being abducted by corrupt overlords, promising through gritted teeth that she would hire international lawyers, that she would take this all the way to the Supreme Court, that history would vindicate her. But history was watching through dozens of neighbors' smartphones and laughing. As the cruiser finally drove away, the neighborhood gathered around me, clapping and cheering like liberation had arrived, and Mrs. Halsey handed out cupcakes someone labeled Karen Farewell Celebration, while Mr. Patterson joked that they should erect a tiny memorial sign reading "Here fell the worst HOA in history." Standing on my porch, the quiet wrapped around me finally without the tension of expecting another outburst, and even though I knew trials and paperwork still lay ahead, a weight lifted off my chest because this time everyone, including the law, was fully aware of the pattern and fully prepared to ensure Karen wouldn't return to unleash more chaos anytime soon. The detective assigned to the case called me the next morning, assuring me that with multiple charges including felony breaking and entering, mail theft, attempted vandalism, and orchestrating a trespassing mob, Karen would not be tasting suburban freedom again until a judge had enjoyed every moment of reviewing the mountain of evidence she had gifted us with her own camera. And so, after weeks of absurdity and laughter and danger and drama, I took one last look at the security screen showing Karen's empty house across the street. For the first time since she tried policing my life, I felt a complete and satisfying calm. In the end, she collected the evidence she desperately hoped would get me evicted, but all she recorded was the undeniable proof of her own downfall.